my gosh, don't you guys love that rebrand? I'm so excited. Welcome, everybody. This is Outpost Gray, a YouTube channel in partnership with Grant Thornton Public Sector. I'm your host, Jack Scott, and I'm going to be providing you information, of course, as always, in cybersecurity, innovation, and technology. And today's guest, I am very excited to have Kurtis Minder on the show today. He is a technologist, a negotiator, and a motorcycle enthusiast of many, many things. So before we hop into that, though, a couple of quick admin notes. As you guys can see, there's a little bit of purple going on, some rebrand happening. So just to let you all know, Outpost Gray has some amazing news, and we are in partnership with Grant Thornton Public Sector. So what does that mean? Well, not a whole lot other than the aspect that Outpost Gray is now going to be supported by a global brand. The content is not going to change. Our times that we're going to be live streaming will not change. The audience, that's not going to change. The only thing that will change is now we are supported by a global brand, which is huge. So there is a lot of changes, but for all of you that's watching this, for all of the followers and all of the subscribers, nothing's going to really apparently change on your end. So I'm really excited about this partnership. We're going to be stepping up the game in a lot of different areas. You'll be seeing some new graphics rolling out. But outside of that, it's just going to be more refined content to help you enjoy your overall experience. So thank you guys. Thank you all for showing up. I'm already looking inside the chat. I see Gerald's popped in there, Michelle, James, as always, Carrie, Jess, I think you were the first one in there today. Requim, it's so nice to see you pop in. Yay. So I'm excited about this. So who do we have on the show today? Kurtis Minder. He is the CEO and the founder of GroupSense. I'm going to let him take a couple of minutes to introduce himself. But today we're going to dig into ransomware negotiations. Have you ever wondered what takes place behind the scenes when you're negotiating with these cyber criminals? I know I have, and today we're going to be able to dig into that, and so will you, because we're going to be doing live Q&A. So as always, make sure if you've got a question for the guest, you throw it into the chat with a capital Q. That will help me pull it out. If you don't, not a big deal. We'll filter it through. So without further ado, let's go ahead and let's bring our guest on the show. Kurtis, welcome.
Hey, thanks for having me.
Thrilled to have you. Okay, so this is a real, you're looking sharp, I gotta say. You look really sharp. Did you dress for just for Outpost Gray in this interview?
For this rebrand, yeah, for the rebrand, I was like, I'm gonna go get the nice suit out for sure. No, I'm actually in New York. I'm keynoting a bankers conference after this. And so I thought I should probably dress like the bankers so they would listen to me.
Yeah, you've had a pretty busy day. What did you have right before this interview?
Wall Street Journal interview, actually.
Yeah, no big deal. No big deal. I love it.
They're extremely professional, as you would imagine, but they don't have as cool kit as you have, which is awesome.
I love that. Still building it out. And you have a partnership with Grant Thornton, and that's how you and I connected. Is through Grant Thornton. Yeah. So if you
we've been partnered for three plus years, I think.
And so what do you do? What is GroupSense, your organization? What does it do with Grant Thornton?
Well, GroupSense as a company is a digital risk protection provider, which is a subscription-based solution around looking for indicators of risk to both enterprises and public sector. So we do a lot of that with Grant Thornton. We also work with Grant Thornton's fraud and risk team, and we provide forensic data that indicate sort of fraud and risk from the cyber perspective that goes into those particular deliverables.
How long have you been in that space? Like, where did GroupSense come from?
Well, I mean, we were pretty early in the sort of external threat intelligence space before it was really a thing, and then it was a confusing thing, and then it became more concrete. We went through the whole roller coaster ride, but we started the company in Arlington, Virginia, just about 8 years ago, and it started with a set of discrete tools to solve very specific problems. For example, corporate data that had been inadvertently leaked, stolen, or was being monetized someplace. Some of the early use cases were really around financials, which I'll talk to the bankers tonight about. But we kept getting asked questions like, okay, so you found our stolen credit cards. What else can you find from where else? And it's like, well, I guess everything from everywhere. So it sort of snowballed on us. And so we built a really strong tech stack to support that over the years. In a weird way, we're sort of like Google for everything that Google doesn't want to Google for, which it's actually a lot.
Yeah.
And then we've also built a team called MSIC, the Managed Security Intelligence Center, that helps enterprises and governments with that data. So a lot of times the data is fairly complex, not as easy to either action or operationalize inside their organization. So we built a team to help them do that.
How important is having intelligence for organization, especially in the world that we live in now with emerging technology and the rise of ransomware that we're seeing coming out, especially around COVID? How important is it for organizations to have intelligence to help them in their fight against the cyber criminals?
Well, I mean, if you think about why, for example, the federal government has intelligence, it's very similar for enterprises where, the government has intelligence programs to inform them about areas of risk and where those threats may emanate from so that they can prioritize their defense and offense spend. CISOs have a real challenge, right? They have a lot of enemies and a very limited budget. So I would say intelligence and or digital risk data is important for helping CISOs solve that problem, prioritize their spend, and make sure they're buying the right tools, the right defenses, and putting the right processes in place, instead of just trying to build a wall and hope that that's going to stop the attack. If you know exactly, narrow down exactly where those threats are coming from, it's very, very useful.
That actually makes me think of something, building the wall, like the moat mentality that we talk about with defense in depth. And we're really, especially in the federal space and with the executive order that came out last summer around zero trust or data-centric approach. What are your thoughts about that? Because right now we have the legacy of using defense in depth. So we've got the castle in the center, you've got the moat, and then you have to get across the bridge. You've got the security guards, but it doesn't really rely on redundancies and looking at it from a lens of, we're going to get attacked. So what do we need to put in place to not just prevent an attack, but withstand an attack? What are your thoughts on the zero trust approach moving into the federal space?
Yeah, well, first I'll say, like many other buzzwords in the industry, zero trust has probably been a little bit diluted with the marketing that goes on. That's understandable. It's important that people recognize that it's a philosophy or a framework and not a product. And so that you can get confused about that. You can't just buy zero trust. That's not a thing you can do. But from a philosophy perspective, it makes total sense. Limiting the access to the very discrete items that a person needs to do their job and controlling that tightly is important, and making that a core philosophy for the access control environment and data environment will ultimately pay back in risk mitigation if there is a threat. I would also say that technology is moving quickly. Bad guys are moving almost as quick. And so I think one of the things that I've noticed in the work that I've been doing, especially around ransomware, is that a lot of the plans that we have developed are still dated. The incident response plans and business continuity plans, for example, are already outdated and they break in certain scenarios. They're not prepared, for example, a lot of the ransomware scenarios, and companies haven't quite caught up to that. And it's definitely a gap.
It is a gap, and I feel like, in speaking from the defense industrial base, like the federal side, especially with our laws and legislation and how far behind it is with our cybersecurity policies, how can we combat that? What is your thoughts? Like, how can we be better at moving those laws forward to start getting closer to defeating our adversary? Or is that even possible?
Well, I'll be realistic about it. The government isn't known for moving quickly. And especially, in policy specifically, it's particularly difficult. I will say that I have firsthand knowledge and have contributed to some of the the thought leadership on that, both in Congress, but also with the administration. And I mean, they're paying attention. But I think before we get to a point where that policy is impactful, it could be a while. So in between, we have to, as practitioners, we have to come up with a stopgap to protect ourselves.
Mm-hmm. All right. So I want to pivot a little bit because I want to talk about a little bit about your career and getting into this space, but like the negotiation piece, that's like the elephant in the room, the negotiation. So how, not just ransomware negotiations, but how did you get into negotiation? Was that something that you went to a school for? Were you self-taught? How did you become a negotiator?
Well, so, I mean, honestly, I was a sales guy for a while, and you kind of have to know how to do that. Like many sales professionals, I read the cliche books like Getting to Yes and things like that help you with those things. But I couldn't say that I was a great negotiator most of my career. I wouldn't say that now. I'm certainly learning. What really accelerated my need to be better at this was the ransomware situation, where I was basically being put in the liaison position between a victim and the threat actor, and with the responsibility of reducing that impact with very little leverage.
Yeah.
And so I went back and sort of relearned a lot of that. I did reread those books. I looked at the Harvard Business Review guides on these practices. I talked to the folks at the Harvard Negotiation Project. I worked with, I've met with and talked to Chris Voss about this. Of course, read Chris Voss's book as well. And I've taken a lot of these tools they're meant for sort of, conference room or maybe buying a car kind of negotiation, and adapted them to this new paradigm in a sort of a creative way.
So you were very much like and I like how you compared having negotiation skills to sales skills, because I think that's really important. And a lot of the books that you've mentioned, I've read a couple of them. And what some of the authors will say is that you're negotiating in every aspect of your life. The thing is you're either good at it or not, but your entire life is a negotiation. And depending on where you're at right now in your life is dependent on how well that you've negotiated. Do you feel like that's an accurate statement?
To some degree, I think there's a lot of nuances there and circumstances that do have impacts. I don't believe in luck. I do think you make your own luck, but that's not all negotiation. Some of that is just hard work. But yes, it does help a lot to recognize the circumstances in which negotiation would give you an advantage and use that tactically throughout your life. Yes.
Mm-hmm. And being in this space, especially with ransomware negotiation, it's a business. Ransomware is a business. That what the cyber criminals are doing is a business, and some of them are very well organized. They've got chat software that you can utilize to speak with their finance department to work the negotiation pieces. Like it's all dependent on how well organized they are, what type of threat group that you're dealing with. And you've had the experience of working with some of these cyber criminals that are asking for ransomware from these organizations. How did you find yourself in that space? Because there's not a lot of people that do this, and it's not something that you're just like, you know what, I want to do negotiations with cyber criminals. Did you just kind of fall into this, or how did it? Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. And I did not originally want to do this, but in the course of GroupSense's normal operations, we do see sort of non-client victim activity. And it's a longer story we probably don't have time for, but it was through that process that we uncovered a pretty large ransomware event, got involved, and sort of got convinced to be the liaison at that time. And then after that, we had a pretty successful result of that. After that, the cyber insurance companies, law firms, and incident responders sort of became a channel bringing these victims to us to help. In the beginning, it was just the negotiation part. Well, I say just, it was the negotiation part and helping with the crypto transaction and compliance, which including OFAC and Treasury Department compliance. And then over time, we evolved the program to include things like business impact assessment, because what was happening is in every case, the first thing the victim would ask, almost every case, victim would ask, hey, should I pay this at all? And the answer is, it depends.
Yeah. And
And,
okay,
and so then how do we come up with the answer to that? Well, we try to make that a quantitative as possible equation. And there's a business, impact sort of matrices that helps you achieve that. Yeah.
And I want to touch on that. So when you're working with the organizations, there's a lot of factors that you have to consider with providing them the consultation of do they pay or do they not pay? Some of the things off the top of my head, I would think about, like, what type of cyber criminal are you working with? Is it one that you know that you're going to get that key, that encryption key of the data, or are you just going to pay and then still not receive the encryption key? And then another factor I'm thinking of is it worth the cost versus just starting over, which is going to cost you more. So when you're going through this, can you provide, like, what are usually the top 3 to 5 things that you usually need to take into consideration when you're talking with a client on if they should pay versus just eat the cost and basically do a reimage of their architectural start over in a way?
Well, yes, actually, a friend of mine is a chief marketing officer at a tech company, and I steal this from him. So sorry, David. He uses this phrase I really like. He calls it the ransomware blast radius, and I think that's the thing that a lot of the victims don't think about. The immediate impact, and obviously part of that equation, one of those 5 things you're asking for, is what is the operational impact to the business? Can you ship products? Can you invoice your customers? Can you make payroll? Those are all pretty impactful things that could, end a business if you're not careful about those, or that you don't remedy them quickly. So the recovery process from that operational impact, I think, is, and what that undertaking is part of the equation. The blast radius, though, is the fallout from a lot of those things. So what does it mean, for example, customer confidence when they can't buy product, when they can't communicate with you, when you miss payroll? What does that do to employee morale? And those are a little bit soft, but you need to put a number on those things. Like, what does it mean if 10% of our employees just quit over this because we didn't pay them? So those things. And then, as you know, the threat actors are, as standard operating procedures, taking a copy of the victim's data often and then leaking that to try to shame you into paying quicker, things like that. What's in that data? Well, depending on the threat actor group, they are a little bit different. Some are more haphazard than others, but a lot of times they'll look through the data set and find the things that are the most impactful to start to leak first to get you to move quickly. And so sometimes that is things like private documents between you and your suppliers or your partners or things like that. And what does that do to your business from a brand perspective? And so a lot of those things people aren't necessarily thinking about those in the moment. They're just thinking about, like, how quickly can we get this operation back up and running? They're not thinking about the follow-on impact of those things. And sometimes those are more costly than restoring. And they last longer. It lasts a long time to repair your brand if, all of your secrets were leaked, for example. Yeah. So
true. I mean, it wasn't a ransomware, but the thing that, and it's probably because it's on the top of my mind because I just wrote a paper about it, but was the S3 breach that took place with Capital One in 2019. And that data that was exfilled by a ex-AWS employee. And that had a major impact on their brand reputation for years. I mean, people are still talking about that being one of the top breaches in 2019. Right. So going back to, actually, I'm gonna pop up a question up here. Samir, thank you so much for dropping this question. I want to make sure that we got to it. Is there a way that you can encrypt your data so that if it was stolen, they can't read it or decrypt it?
Sure. Yeah. Now there's a nuance to that. They can't read it. So, them spilling the data, that you basically take that tool away from them because they can't read the data. So sure, using strong AES-256 symmetric encryption on your data at rest and in transit will help with that. But that they can still execute the ransomware on that data. So they can still encrypt your encrypted data and make your, basically cease the operational capacity of the company. And the other, there's a little slight risk with this is it's not really a good idea to encrypt encrypted files. They tend to not recover from that. So there is some risk also if you're encrypting all the data that if you double encrypt it or the bad guys encrypt it again, that even if you get the key and then you decrypt your data, it may not come back to life. And that's one of the risks.
Corrupting the data. Absolutely smart on that. Another question. I think this was Requim. I think you asked this while we were talking about maybe some of the books that you had mentioned. Was there a book that you found that was eye-opening on your second read?
That's a tough one. I'll have to think about that. So, I mean, if you're referring to the the negotiation books,
Yeah, I think that's what it was. Yeah.
Here's the thing I like about the Chris Voss book, and we're like all in each other's DMs. So he's going to text me after I say this, probably. So, but the thing I like about the Chris Voss book is it actually does teach a lot of the same principles that you will find in the other books, but the way that he teaches it, the way that he explains these methods, it's just easier to consume, and the use cases are really impactful. He's talking about hostage negotiation, not buying a car, and although he does have an anecdote about buying a car, but most of them are very impactful, and the circumstances are very, because he was a hostage negotiator for the FBI, are very important. Like there's people's lives on the line, so you can see sort of the difference between a business negotiation and somebody might die if you do this wrong. How important these steps are. There's another part of that book that I like called Tactical Empathy, where he talks about empathy for the person you're engaging with. And to be clear, it's empathy, not sympathy. They're different. But putting yourself in that person's shoes in that very moment. And one of the things I think that makes GroupSense better at this is that we know a lot about bad guys. We literally follow bad guys around the internet all day. That's our job. And so we know a lot about how they operate, where they are, what tools they have, et cetera. And those things allow us to use that tactical empathy very, very usefully. Yeah.
Okay, so let's go back to negotiating with cyber criminals. I'm really interested because, the articles I've read, it sounds like there can be some back and forth, like you're going to pay, 500 in Bitcoin. No, I'm going to only pay 5 in Bitcoin. What does real world negotiation look like when you're working or negotiating with a cyber criminal? Can you give an example of how that would work?
I can give tons of examples, but I mean, to first answer your question directly, the problem is it's different per group and they're changing pretty frequently. When we started doing it, I would say that a handful of the major groups that you've heard about on the news, for example, had a pretty refined playbook, and we knew it. And so we were pretty bold going into those cases where we would say, like, look, this is going to take 5 days. Mm-hmm. They are going to ask for this, and they're going to settle for that, and they'll honor the ransom, and that's it. And so usually in some margin of error, we were pretty correct. There's a lot of volatility in the groups right now, and they're changing a lot of their tactics and methods, et cetera. So I will say for us, it's a little bit more intellectually stimulating, because when that playbook became a thing, we're like, well, this is pretty much a robotic process at that point. And frankly, one of the harder parts of this is also dealing with the victim.
Yeah.
And it depends on the size of the company and things like that. But so all of our focus kind of went into that. Now, the threat actors are changing things up pretty frequently. And for example, a Phobos or something that does smaller asks and does a higher volume of victims behaves completely differently than a Conti does. And then going back to your question, it does start with, this chat where they say, hey, they like their brand. So they're like, hey, we're Conti, and we've done this to you, and the do's and don'ts, all the things that you'll probably also see in the ransom note, but they'll say this in the chat, and then they'll ask you for an amount, usually in Bitcoin, sometimes in Monero, or sometimes they'll do Bitcoin and give you a discount to use Monero, which is interesting. And then that's when it starts, and you have to. We also have a saying in GroupSense where negotiations end well when they start well. And I only say that because we always start them well by design, but sometimes we get brought in after the victim themselves has tried to start the process, and that is very difficult to reverse.
I can imagine that's why they're calling you in, because it's not going well.
Yeah.
So sometimes I've read sometimes you'll pay the ransom. They may give you an encryption key. They may not. Let's say they do. They give you the encryption key, and then they still spill your information on the dark web. Have you experienced that where you did the negotiation, you got it down to what was reasonable, you paid it, you got the key, and then the data was still leaked?
Not to my knowledge publicly. I have not seen that, but we have seen evidence, and I think we published a blog on this. I'm embarrassed if we haven't done it yet, but basically we have seen evidence that, and we sort of knew this, but now we've seen actual evidence that they've taken that data and that they said they deleted, and they've used it. I like to say they drafted off that data to execute other attacks, either on other victims, or in this case, they've attacked the same victim that they attacked with ransomware, but this time they'll use the data to execute a business email compromise attack or something like that. So yes, the data does still, like they may honor the ransom and get your files decrypted, but don't assume that they're not going to continue to weaponize that data in some way against you or your partners.
Yeah, you guys actually did post an article. I don't know if it's one you're talking about. I think it's different. It's the data leaks from the Conti ransomware group. And I'll share this with anybody in the chat that wants to see it. That was recently out on groupsense.io. You can just go to groupsense.io and check it out. But it was on March 24th, dark reading what the Conti ransomware group data leaks tell us. On this one right here, this is around what's been taking place in Ukraine and some of the activities there, and approximately 400 files, including thousands of internal chat logs. Like, what does this say for us? What do we need to be concerned about with this information that Conti has been leaking out?
Well, in this case, it was Conti's internal information. And what had happened is, we think that what had happened is Conti had made a very public statement that was very pro-Russia. Some of their members are actually Ukrainian, and we believe an insider basically took this insider information and dumped it. And what we learned from that, there's a lot of stuff that we learned from it, but a lot of it we kind of already knew, which is it's a business. There are, executive staff, there are middle managers, there are new recruits, there are vertical focuses, there are different compensation plans, there are, recruiting, that it's got all the things. And my favorite part is there are inter-office politics and where they're talking to each other and bitching about someone else or something like that. So it's interesting.
Yeah. And I love that. I was hoping you would bring it around to that, because I wanted to make a point to tell everybody that, again, the cyber warfare, cyber criminals, these gangs, they work, a lot of them, not all of them, but the professional ones work as an organization. And so what happened here was a disgruntled employee, we'll assume, wasn't happy with what was happening and then spilled the data out. And it's caused a lot of issues, as you can imagine. Insider threat, this perfect example of insider threat.
I know, I was gonna say it's irony that Conti has insider threat problems, but yeah.
And they're the ones that are recruiting individuals to give them information to get insider threats inside of the organization. It's full circle going on right there. So let's pivot. Let's talk about more of like the softer side of Kurtis and some of the other fun things that you do. Because I think this is it's the full spectrum of your background, but you also you write articles for motorcycle magazines, different things like that. So you're a big motorcyclist, big outdoors person. You live in Colorado.
Yeah.
I
don't get to write for the magazines as much as I used to, because I'm so busy arguing with bad guys in Belarus these days. But I've been a contributor to motorcycle magazines. I have been one of the positive perks from that is BMW will give me a motorcycle and go ride that around and write an article about it. So it's pretty cool. So my whole life I've been a motorcycle nerd, and the motorcycling in Colorado is quite nice. Lots of beautiful places. Yeah, lots of beautiful places to ride. And I'm also, an outdoorsman, fitness person. I run. So, that's my spare time is spent doing those things: camping, hiking, motorcycling, etc.
And we have a question around your motorcycling skills from Orinoka, sorry if I messed up your name a little bit, but if you wanted to put yourself out of the ransomware negotiation business, more time for motorcycling and riding, what are the top ways you would recommend to businesses to help mitigate their risk?
That's
Great question.
That's a really well-worded question. I like that.
Yeah.
So actually it's pertinent and it's a passion project of mine as well. So thank you for asking that. What we learned from most of these attacks is that they're preventable.
Mm-hmm.
And I remember a journalist, I forget which one it was, so I'm embarrassed, but there was a journalist who I was talking to about this, and the journalist said, people don't understand that we're at war with these people, these ransomware actors. And I said, well, it's kind of a weird war though. It's a war where They're standing on one side of the river with a bunch of spears, and we're standing on the other side of the river with shields on the ground. And all we have to do is kneel and do this, and they'll either run out of spears or go someplace else. So it's kind of a weird war. And so, yes, there are some basic, attack vectors that get reused and reused by these threat actors. I also tell business a lot of times that the attack vectors are not complicated or complex. The organizations executing them are. So they have a business model. They have an ROI. They're not buying 0 days on the dark net to attack your business. They're not creating custom malware to attack your business. Mm-hmm. Usually what they're doing is using your bad cyber hygiene and or leaked data against you. And not to make people roll their eyes, but it is true that most of these attacks come through things like reused corporate credentials and passwords, not having multi-factor authentication, very simple things like that. Some of the larger attacks that we've heard about on TV happen because a corporate employee used their corporate credential. They signed up for a third-party site that wasn't business related. That third-party site had crappy security. It got hacked. Yeah. They used the same or similar password they use at work. The VPN or RDP ports that were open because of work at home didn't have multi-factor authentication, and the bad guys just logged in.
Yeah, going back to that defense in depth approach or zero trust.
Zero trust would fix that. Zero trust and multi-factor authentication would get rid of a significant percentage of the attacks alone. Those two things alone, with better password and credential policy and multi-factor authentication. Would get rid of those things. Yeah.
100%. We'll just keep beating that drum, though. We'll see if we start figuring out as organizations grow. I have a question on the Conti document. Tom, I thought I've heard both, but was it an insider threat or someone infiltrated? I initially heard infiltrated, but I thought it was an insider threat.
Everybody seems to think that it was an insider threat, but I don't think there was actually any hard evidence to support that. But it happened the day after they made this, I believe the day after they made this very pro-Russian blog post.
Yeah. Tom, if you've got anything, drop it in the chat. That would be great. Samir had a great question, and this was really interesting. Really good question. What are the legal procedures for documenting the negotiation for future trial? That's a really good question. Like, how long do you keep that documentation at the organizational level?
Well, we keep it forever, the actual negotiation. But we also, so one of the things we did in the beginning is this whole ransomware negotiation business was nascent when we started, but we noticed that a few of the other practitioners that had been doing this, that were, that's their core business. This is a secondary business for us. We had our core digital risk business, that there were a couple issues. One, the way that they charged for it seemed a little bit like profiteering from victims. So we wanted to make sure that we were really fair with how we charged for our services. Two, you're basically talking to a bad guy in the dark web ad hoc. Mm-hmm. And some of the negotiation firms were just saying, okay, I'm going to go talk to this guy. I'm going to get it as low as I can. I'll call you back. The problem with that is it's rife for fraud and it lacks transparency. And the lacking transparency would create an environment where you could be accused of fraud, even if you didn't do that. And so we, at the very beginning, built a 100% transparent process where it's a little bit heavy lift, but where every single message that is sent is vetted and discussed by the victim and approved by the victim. And sometimes our victims edit those. Sometimes that's funny. And we do, and as part of that process, the victim ends up with a deliverable of everything that was said, done, sent, etc. At the end of this, including all of the OFAC sanction checks, the crypto analysis on where the wallets are domiciled, all that stuff's recorded into a deliverable at the end of a case.
Yeah, so you have a ransomware hotline on your, here, I'm going to see if I should have tested this out because sometimes it'll work and sometimes it won't. My Mac doesn't like me.
This format is so cool. Oh, nice.
Yeah. So this is everybody, this is GroupSense, great website. Definitely go check it out.
Check out our featured content, Jax.
Yeah, right there. Look at that. You guys should go check out How to Negotiate with Cyber Threat Actors podcast going on right now. But we've got this ransomware hotline. Where does this number go if somebody was to dial this?
We have an answering service that has a basically a set of questions that they ask, and then they turn that over to a team lead for the negotiation.
I love that. Okay, perfect. So if anybody needs to call about ransomware, so let's talk about some of the different services that GroupSense provides. So you work on dark web monitoring. I know that is an area when people hear about the dark, the deep, the dark web, which are two different things. So everybody knows it's kind of sexy. They're like, oh my gosh, the dark web. What does it mean when you provide dark web monitoring to your clients?
Well, first I will answer that, but first I will say that plenty of nefarious stuff happens elsewhere. So while the dark web is important to monitor, a lot of bad things happen on just regular platforms, the internet, et cetera. And all of those things are important to keep track of. When you're monitoring the dark web, we're basically looking at, well, you've got the bullets there. So I'm not going to read my own bullets. I'm just going to ad hoc it. Okay. So yes, but you're basically monitoring threat actor activity. Conversation is actually a good way to put it, because a lot of this stuff doesn't always happen in the forum itself. The threat actor will advertise something, and the actual sort of details around that transaction happen in a one-on-one chat in some foreign language, usually over Jabber or Telegram or something similar. So it's not just detecting the threat actors, advertisements or discussions about a particular company or their data. It's also, and this is part of what that MSIC team that I talked about at the beginning do really well, is when we see something that we think is impacting our clients, we engage with the threat actors and we talk to them. And we try to figure out, is it real? Are they full of crap? Do they actually have the data they say they have? That sort of thing. And so there's some validation. But to do that well, to do the monitoring well, you also have to be very good at making sure you know where the threat actors are operating, and they move around. The dark web is a large it's a large place. Not all of it is bad, and there's a lot of illicit marketplaces there. But out of the hundreds of illicit marketplaces, there's probably like 30 that companies at any given time that companies really need to worry about what's going on in there related to corporate risk. And so knowing which ones those are and when they're moving them around and changing, ownership and stuff like that is a full-time sort of intelligence job.
Yeah, that's why also attribution is so hard. I mean, they're ever changing, and especially I can imagine. I've been to I've worked in and been in the dark web, but that's not an area I play in. But I know that, how it's designed is to provide, you're not attributed, you're going through the Tor network, and it's going to be extremely hard to attribute activity in that environment. I have a question here from James, and I like what he's asking. Have you had any clients that they were fined or prosecuted for paying a ransom because the U.S. government considered the payment illegal?
No. Because the payment, so the only time a payment is illegal is if the entity that we're paying on the other side is on the OFAC, Office of Foreign Asset Control sanctions list, which is maintained by the Treasury Department. And we go to great lengths to make sure that we know that that is not true before we facilitate a payment. So no.
Yeah, good point on that. How effective is cyber insurance? I love this because
less and less every day.
Yeah, becoming increasingly popular. But do you still see? Because I'm not really in the mix of cyber insurance. It was growing for the last about 2 years ago, but now there's a lot of compliance factors that they're in placing with the cyber insurance companies are putting a lot of parameters in place before they're going to give an organization cybersecurity insurance. So it's kind of starting to plateau. Yep. But how effective do you think it is?
Well, I think that particular process is very good because if you guys anybody's ever signed up for cyber insurance as a company, they used to just send you a questionnaire.
Yeah.
You said yes or no, and then they sent you an underwriting policy and you signed it, and that was it. But a lot of because of the number of cases that they've had to pay out on, and specifically like these larger software supply chain attacks that have affected their actuary tables pretty significantly, they are now validating that you're actually doing the things that you say you do, testing them in some technical, quantitative way before they underwrite the policy.
Yeah, Oh, go ahead. Sorry.
No, that's it. Go ahead.
I just see from my perspective, I think cybersecurity insurance is garbage. I think if you're doing the right things that you need to do and you're putting them in place, there's so much that's going to go into you receiving that payout. We saw it with Merck's that happened with that breach that happened with NotPetya. It took years and tons of legal hearings before they even got a payout. Organizations might not be able to afford that at that scale, like Merck's could, because I mean, it's $1 billion company. What are your thoughts on that for these smaller organizations that would benefit? Because I don't see it benefiting these larger organizations maybe as much as smaller. Maybe I have that flipped in my mind of where cybersecurity insurance would fit best.
Well, so you bring up a good point. The fine print is important, and first thing I would say to anybody that if you have a policy now, read it now, because you don't want to read it when the thing happens.
Yeah.
The way that these things end up in court like this is when the policy dictates, for example, your response order, timing, et cetera. You have to call this person in this order, et cetera, and you don't do it in the order that's in the fine print in the policy, and then they make an excuse not to pay. So certainly read your policy. that helps. But yeah, so I think I won't necessarily jump on the garbage bandwagon, but I would say that the real benefit of cyber insurance would be, paying against something that you couldn't defend against. And they don't do that. So that would be like, almost every policy now has a state like, look, if it's a nation state attack, we're not going to pay.
Right.
Well, that's when you exactly need it.
Yeah.
Because a nation state attack has unlimited resources. And if you're just a small business, there's no way you're going to win that. That's what insurance should be for. Yeah. But it's sort of backwards. It is. I do think it is useful for some of the small businesses. And to my knowledge, they're not having the sort of the litigated problems that you're talking about in the payouts. But the impact monetarily is smaller for them. So the insurance company, sort of just like, oh, let's total it, right? And they just pay the ransom and then it's done, right? Yep.
That's very interesting. So how often have you worked with insurance companies when you've been doing ransomware negotiations and working with these organizations to get their data back?
Almost all the time, very, very frequently. Sometimes we're not working directly with them, but they're on the calls, but they're not necessarily telling us, what we should be doing. Yeah.
Lola had a great question. She said, cybersecurity insurance, is it necessary evil since it's required for audits for certain organizations?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, we're required to have it as part of our, as part of our compliance.
Yeah, I think that cyber insurance is just going to start becoming more pronounced, depending on the space that you're in, depending on maybe the third-party vendor that you're working with. You may not need it, but the organization that you're a third-party vendor might want you to have it, and therefore you need to get $1 million coverage. And we're diving into cybersecurity insurance. And I know this isn't your area of expertise, but you've dealt with this area. What is a typical time if an organization's breached? They need money. They need to be up. They need to be operational like yesterday. How quickly is this money turned around for these organizations? 30, 60 days? Do you know?
I don't really know. I do know that it is delayed a lot of times. They'll go through, they'll self-fund the whole process and then have to get reimbursed like you do in other insurance scenarios sometimes, like where you total your car, you go pay the people and you get a check from the insurance company or something like that. So yes, it also depends on the insurer and the underwriter, how that's done. But I do know that it's usually after the event that they're getting compensated for it. I will say one more thing on the compliance side, like, as annoying as that is, if the two things are combined, I'm required to do this because of compliance, and the cyber insurance company is going to make sure I'm doing those 5 things that you asked about, I actually do think it has a positive effect because it's forcing people's hands to just do the things that they're refusing to do. Despite all of this, they continue to refuse to do these basic things. So, it's a weird way to go about it, but it's actually getting it done.
Yeah, it is. And I like this. Another great question from Orinoka is, given the new legislation, and I love this question, should the government take a larger role in ransomware recovery for impacted organizations? And this is addressed to like public, charity, those smaller organizations that are going to have the larger impacts.
Yes, I do believe that. So I'm not confident that it's going to get done in a timely fashion, but yes, and I am involved. Like, I'm talking to these people in the policy making arena about these things. Actually, this morning I was on a call with some folks talking about this exact thing in Washington, saying, look, right now, most of these small businesses have two options: go out of business, pay a ransom.
Yeah.
Can you give them a third option, please? Can you please give them a third? You want it to stop? Give them a third option. And so that, yes, I do think that there's an opportunity for legislation to impact this.
Yeah. How do you think that could be rolled out, though? Do you think that CISA, with the myriad of different departments that they have under DHS, where maybe they have a specific IR recovery department task force that goes out and helps these organizations if they incur a breach? Because that's funding. That's going to be, how is that going to look? How are we going to support an entity like that to support these organizations?
Well, obviously it's complex, and I'm not a government guy. I'm trying to influence policy, but I don't know much about how these things get done, frankly. But I'm learning as I go, and we're very friendly with CISA, and I do think highly of a lot of the team there. And I'm also following very closely the legislation that, for example, Gary Peters is putting forward, and those sorts of things around cryptocurrency policy and ransomware policy. The one thing that I've been reinforcing when I'm talking to these folks is that whoever does it, the best ROI is prevention. Mm-hmm. So do that first, prioritize that. And then if someone goes through the steps of the prevention steps and still gets hit, give them that third option. And I do also think that if we find a way to get more transparency around the number of payments that are going out that nobody's talking about, specifically in Main Street, like middle America, small to medium businesses in high volume every day, that there would be a pretty clear ROI for funding a program like that. But we don't really have that visibility right now. We have a little bit, it's a little bit fragmented. And so, we're also looking at ideas on how to get that visibility without imposing on people's privacy and individual liberties, right?
Yeah, we're seeing more and more movement in the space of legislation around cybersecurity. The CMMC was a big rollout for the supply chain, and we saw the executive order come out last May for really focusing in on zero trust and implementing more feature multi-factor authentication, things like that within the federal space. What everybody needs to know, though, is the federal government can do a lot of these laws and legislation and can enroll this out. A lot of it's going to be recommended. They can become laws eventually, but it's going to be a lot of recommendations, but it will only impact the federal space. And so we can make these changes in the federal space, but we still have, for example, a lot of our critical infrastructures are owned by private sector. So we still have to consider that they're not going to be impacted by the laws and legislation like the public sector will be. So we still have to combat, how do we get, and we don't have time to even answer this, but how do we get that private sector on board to do the right thing? Because they're going to be the organizations that are going to have the biggest impacts on the federal space.
Yeah, so I do agree that education tends to fix a lot of things. And so I think part of it's a big education effort. The other thing is, I just want to say, focusing and prioritizing critical infrastructure makes total sense. But I'm also going to argue that small to medium businesses in America are collectively critical infrastructure because they make up almost half the economy and more than half the jobs. And they're getting hit. You don't hear about them on TV. And a lot of them don't get reported to law enforcement, et cetera. And we just don't know what's happening. But they're getting hit at a very high rate. And so, I'd like to see some focus on policy to help those folks.
100%. Small business is the backbone of America. It is how we thrive. I absolutely agree with you on that. We need to have more focus there. Hopefully we'll see some things start rolling out in the next 1 to 2 years. Okay, so Kurtis, before I take you off and put you back screen, let's do some final thoughts. And because I know you have to go do a keynote, which is awesome, but final thoughts that you would like to leave with the viewers, maybe any big project that GroupSense is rolling out that you want to talk about, anything at all?
Yeah, actually it's timely, because of what we just talked about. We are launching a nonprofit to do exactly what I just said, which is we're building a nonprofit. It's partnership with universities and corporate tech sponsors that is helping small businesses assess and remediate those basic things so that they're not ransomware victims. We are looking at potentially building a response program for those who have gone through the program and still get hit. All the things that we talked about, we're building a mechanism to do it now. We're not going to do it in 3 years. We're going to do it now. And so the announcement's not out yet because we're waiting on a few of the partnership stuff to get done. But we're gonna work on that problem. GroupSense is going to be a contributor, but it's a separate 501c3 partner with universities and local communities to solve the problem.
I love that. That is amazing. So I dropped your information, LinkedIn in there, GroupSense IO partner and partner-program for anybody that wants to connect with Kurtis. Is the best way for people to reach out to you through LinkedIn,
Sure.
through the website? Okay.
Yeah, that's
awesome.
I get a lot of in-mails, but I do read them all.
I love it. Well, this has been fantastic. Thank you so much for making the time and coming on the show. We'll have to do another follow-up after you've launched and you founded your 501. It's going to be a 501c3. Okay, perfect. Yep, I'd love to have you back on to talk about that, the mission and vision of it.
All right. Thank you so much. It was a pleasure being here. Thanks for having me. And also I guess I was like the inaugural guest with the whole rebrand, which is really cool. Thank you.
It actually worked out really well because your company is already in partnership with Grant Thornton. So it was ideal. Yeah. I told Dave I was going to have you on tonight. I don't know if he made it on LinkedIn, but yeah, hey, super thrilled. First one I know. Hey, Dave. It's awesome. It's a joy. I'll have to definitely hit you up when I go back to Colorado in the very near term.
Well, and I'll be in your neighborhood pretty frequently.
Okay. Definitely connect with me. Thanks, Kurtis. You're the best.
All right. Take care.
Bye.
Bye.
Wow, that was amazing, you guys. Thanks for the engagement, everybody in the chat. Definitely a wealth of knowledge from Kurtis. So make sure to reach out to him. You have his LinkedIn information and you've got his website. So let me do a really quick update for you all on what we've got going on for next week. I am doing my shared screen. Yes. So I'm really excited about next week's guest. I think I'm always excited about the guest. Why wouldn't I be? But next week on Thursday during our live stream, I'm going to have Christian on the show. We are going to talk. If you don't know Christian Espinoza, he is the author. He's a veteran. He is a founder, and he is the author of the book called The Smartest Person in the Room. And I have read 75% of this book. I need to finish it. School books are taking precedent right now. The book really dives into understanding emotional intelligence. And I really like the lens that he uses within this book, but it really digs into understanding emotional intelligence. So if you're curious about understanding what is emotional intelligence, how is it impacting us in the cybersecurity space, you're going to want to tune in next week on Thursday. For anybody that just popped in and maybe was not at the start of this, I just want to give you a quick update of the rebrand that you're seeing right here with everything up top. This is Outpost Gray in partnership. Yeah, you're reading that correctly, with Grant Thornton. So what does that mean for you? It means that you're going to see a little bit more purple throughout everything. The content's going to remain the same. The guests coming on the show, the quality is going to remain the same. Actually, let me rephrase that. The quality is just going to get better because now Outpost Gray is supported by a global brand. So I'm very excited about this. I'm excited that Grant Thornton has trusted me and Outpost Gray to push their vision forward. We are partnered specifically with Grant Thornton, the public sector, so the federal side. So there's going to be more panels coming out, more firesides, and I'll have more guests on the show that are from Grant Thornton, just like Kurtis, who's his company is in partnership with Grant Thornton. Outside of that, you guys, thank you. Thank you for everybody for showing up. I would recommend you've got about 3 minutes for Simply Cyber to start. So let's go over there and raid Simply Cyber and make sure when you hop over to Simply Cyber, you put hashtag Outpost Gray in the chat to make sure that Gerald knows that you guys came over from this show. And as always, you guys make this happen. Go ahead, like, share, subscribe, send this out to everybody. And I will see you all next Thursday coming up at 3:30 p.m. I'm out. Bye, all.